In the hunt for Bismarck, most people tend to think of the Battle of Denmark Strait and the destruction of HMS Hood, or alternatively, the air attack by HMS Ark Royal that crippled Bismarck and left her vulnerable to surface attack. There was, however, another aspect to that hunt that tends to be a bit more overlooked: the steady tracking of the battleship by HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk. Those cruisers and their radar kept a close eye on Bismarck for much of the chase, and allowed for catching the battleship in the end. In today's video, we'll be focusing on Norfolk. Her actions in shadowing Bismarck will be a big part, though we'll also look at the rest of her service, from escorting convoys to participating in the sinking of another German battleship. In that case, it was Scharnhorst at the Battle of the North Cape. Suffice it to say that Norfolk got up to a surprising amount of surface action, especially for spending her entire combat career in the Atlantic or the Arctic. She wouldn't fight the Italians or the Japanese, as it would turn out. In any event, though, let's get into things. We'll begin with a brief overview of her design, and then move to service history. First, the displacement. For Norfolk, this came out to around 9,900 tons when at standard loading, with the full load coming out to 13,450 tons. That displacement allowed for what was the standard British heavy cruiser layout, consisting of 8 8-inch 203mm guns and 4 twin turrets, a super firing pair on the bow and another pair on the stern. Those weapons were supported by a further 8 4-inch 102mm guns and 4 twin mountings, with those clustered around the amidships superstructure, while offensive weaponry was rounded off by 2 quadruple torpedo mounts, for 8 torpedoes in all, with 1 mount on either broadside. Defensive weaponry, meanwhile, varied greatly on when you're looking at the ship. Initially, it was 2 octuple 40mm pom-poms, along with 2 quadruple 50 caliber Vickers machine guns. Later in the ship's career, this would be reinforced by 6 quad pom-pom mounts, along with 9 single 40mm Bofors mounts, and 11 single 20mm guns. Although this came at the cost of removing the third 8-inch gun turret in 1944 in order to save weight. And that covers the weaponry. Now for the armor. Norfolk initially followed other county-class cruisers in having no belt armor, instead focusing on armored boxes around the magazines. She would end up with a 3.5-inch 89mm thick belt in a later refit. Still not particularly thick, but at least it was an armor belt at all. Now, the reason for this lack of protection was actually fairly simple. To keep the ship within the Washington Treaty limits, the British had to make a sacrifice. They wanted cruisers with heavy firepower, long range, and relatively high speed. Something had to be cut, and that was the armor, which resulted in a relatively lightly protected ship that could reach a little over 32 knots, on 80,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. And that rounds off the design details. So with all of that covered, let's look at Norfolk's service. For this ship, that began on July 8, 1927. She was laid down by Fairfield Shipbuilding, who would build the ship relatively quickly. Norfolk was launched on December 12, 1928, about a year and a half later, with the ship commissioned on April 30th of 1930. at which point her service would be largely similar to other British cruisers. A couple years with the home fleet before being used on various foreign stations. In her case, Norfolk would be with the home fleet until 1932, including the Invergordon Mutiny in September of 1931. Now, I've touched on this a couple times before. This was a short-lived affair, primarily over pay cuts in the aftermath of the Great Depression. This wasn't at all a violent affair, and mostly consisted of men refusing to perform their duties. In any event, that was about it for excitement with the home fleet. Norfolk would be sent off to the West Indies in 1932, where the cruiser remained until 1934, serving as the flagship for the 8th Cruiser Squadron, based out of Bermuda. With this concluding at the end of 1934, when the cruiser was transferred to the East Indies Station. That came in 1935, with Norfolk remaining in the area through 1939. Understandably, by the end of this period, the ship was in need of a refit. This would find Norfolk in dock for overhaul when the Second World War broke out in September 1939. Fortunately, this came at the end of her refit. Norfolk was out of dock by September 6th, returning to the 8th Cruiser Squadron, but this time as part of the home fleet. Although this would be a very short stint before the cruiser was reassigned once more. She would spend September of 1939 on patrol duty, as well as escorting home the damaged HMS Spearfish on September 25th. In October, however, Norfolk shifted to the 1st Cruiser Squadron. This would see her reassigned to the Mediterranean with a base out of Alexandria. At least that was the theory. As it would turn out, Norfolk would only spend a couple weeks in the Mediterranean, before being ordered back home at the start of November 1939. Admittedly, this wasn't particularly surprising, as Italy was still neutral at this point, while the threat of German raiders was a very real concern. Norfolk was, because of this, put back on patrol duty, with the cruiser assigned to the Denmark Strait on November 18th. It was during this patrol that Norfolk received her first orders to go after German battleships. On the 23rd, she would join with other British cruisers in searching for the terrible twins, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, fresh off their sinking of Rawalpindi. Unfortunately for the British, the German battleships made their escape in rough weather. Norfolk would be ordered home once this became apparent, sailing back to Scapa Flow. It was during this voyage that the ship almost had a run-in with some seriously bad luck. The Germans had submarines patrolling the area, including one U-47. This boat, much more famous for the sinking of Royal Oak, fired one torpedo on November 27th. This would miss, exploding to Norfolk's stern. After this close call, the cruiser would sail to Belfast for a refit on December 6th. A refit that ran through the rest of 1939, with Norfolk returning to service on January 10th, 1940. Albeit this would be quiet service. The cruiser spent the early months of 1940 on yet more patrol duty. Not much of note would actually happen during this. At least not on the actual patrols. Something did happen while in port on March 16, 1940, when the Germans sent an air raid against Scapa Flow. Norfolk would take a bomb hit on her quarterdeck near Y turret. This blew a hole in the ship and flooded her aft magazine, although fortunately she didn't suffer any secondary explosions. That said, it was still substantial damage. The cruiser was back in dock for repair work, with this lasting a couple months. Norfolk only rejoined the fleet on June 24th of 1940. Not much of note would happen after this for quite a while. Norfolk spent July through October on patrol. There was a chance for combat in September 1940. Norfolk joined Hood and Repulse in a sweep off of Norway, but failed to find anything of note. Then in October, another short refit followed, where the cruiser picked up a useful piece of equipment. A new radar set, which would certainly come in handy later on in 1941. After this, it was back to patrol, along with convoy escort duty, to spice things up. Norfolk escorted a convoy to Suez on November 18th, but she was detached on the 23rd, initially to return to Scapa Flow on the 28th, only to be sent to Freetown in December 1940 to join Hunting Group K. In this, she joined HMS Berwick and the carrier Formidable in hunting for the cruiser Admiral Hipper. Of course, the German ship managed to avoid detection, leaving Norfolk to return to convoy escort in January 1941. Or at least this was the plan. Norfolk joined a convoy on January 8th, but she was detached on January 9th to try and hunt down the raider Cormoran in the South Atlantic, while other sources will say January 18th. Regardless, as HMAS Sydney could tell you, this would be a failure. With Cormoran slipping the net as it were, Norfolk spent the rest of January and February on more escort duty. It was only in March 1941 that she returned to patrolling the Denmark Strait, something that continued through April and into May of 1941, which is where her most famous duty came into play. During Bismarck's sortie into the Atlantic in May 1941, Norfolk would stalk the battleship, first sighting Bismarck on May 23rd alongside HMS Suffolk. In this, Norfolk had the misfortune to be spotted in turn. Bismarck fired 5 salvos at the cruiser before Norfolk found cover in rain. This obscured her from the German gunnery, but let the cruiser's radar keep an eye open. Norfolk and Suffolk would continue to stalk Bismarck until the battleship reversed course around midnight on May 24th. The Germans would temporarily chase the cruisers off, leaving them out of position when the Battle of Denmark Strait broke out, and HMS Hood sank in catastrophic fashion. Norfolk and Suffolk, now joined by the damaged Prince of Wales, continued to trail the Germans until losing contact on May 25th. However, unlike the other two, Norfolk would join Rodney and King George V in engaging the German battleship on May 27th, with the cruiser ultimately firing 4 torpedoes and 527 8-inch shells at Bismarck. The torpedoes missed, but the shell fire at least kept the Germans occupied. In any event, after Bismarck sank, things would be quiet again. June 1941 was spent on escort duty, with July through August on another refit. In October, however, Norfolk joined her first Arctic convoy, which would become her main duty through to 1943 with a couple breaks. First in November 1941, when she operated near Iceland. This was intended to keep an eye out in case Tirpitz tried a breakout. When that didn't happen, Norfolk returned to convoy escort. She would spend most of 1942 on this role, barring the odd refit. with the exception of late October when the cruiser left the frozen north for the sunny Azores. Norfolk would join HMS Cumberland off those islands as a distant covering force for the Operation Torch landings, with those coming in early November. By December, however, it was back to the Arctic convoys, which would continue for the majority of 1943 as well. There would only be a couple breaks in this, aside from refits. One came in July 1943 when the cruiser joined HMS Anson and USS Alabama as part of a diversion off Norway to draw German attention away from the Operation Husky landings in Sicily. Another came at the end of the year with the Battle of the North Cape on December 26, 1943. Norfolk would join other cruisers in supporting HMS Duke of York during the engagement with Scharnhorst, with Sheffield sighting the battleship around 9:20 in the morning. Norfolk opened fire at 9:30, firing 6 salvos. This saw 2 hits to Scharnhorst, although the battleship made her escape. A second engagement came around noon, with Norfolk hit 2 times in turn. One wrecked the X turret, another exploded amidships. This killed 6 of the crew, with Norfolk forced to break off with engine trouble. She would join up with Duke of York later that day and fire a few more times before Scharnhorst was sent under. Unfortunately, that damage largely took Norfolk out of the war. She would be under repair for most of 1944 from February to November. It was at this point the damaged X turret was replaced by more anti-aircraft guns. Even after she came out of refit, however, the ship was on second line duty. She engaged a German convoy off Norway in January 1945, helping to sink 3 ships, and then spent February through May on escort duty, ultimately ending the war, covering the liberation of Copenhagen. Norfolk would then transport the King of Norway back to his homeland in June 1945, before spending July through August on refit. She wouldn't sail to the Pacific or to war with Japan. Instead, Norfolk would spend 1945 through 1949 in the East Indies on training duty, before being decommissioned in 1949 and scrapped in 1950. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.